Hey everybody, Smart Silver Stacker here. Inflation is a problem that the mainstream has really gotten a taste of here in 2022, and it's a problem that we stackers have been aware of and anticipating and preparing for some time now. Now, up until this point, despite the fact that we have the highest inflation in over 40 years, precious metals are still pretty cheap. So, did we stackers get it wrong? I don't think so. I think we're just early to the party. You see, right now, a lot of investors and the public in general, they genuinely believe that inflation is going to be brought under control. And here's my forecast. We have seen a fairly significant pullback in the price of crude oil over the past month. And when we get the official CPI numbers for July later this month, I believe those lower energy costs are going to be showing up in the print, and it's actually going to start coming down. Now, that doesn't mean that prices will be falling, they're just not going to be going up as quickly as they have been. And this trend of a declining year-over-year CPI, it could persist for a few months. July, August, September, they may all have a lower year-over-year CPI number. And, we'll be hearing from the administration and the Fed about how successful they've been in their fight against inflation and how the inflation has peaked, but this pullback in inflation is going to be a temporary phenomenon. And in this video, I'm going to be covering 5 scenarios that could lead to massively higher inflation by the end of the year in the winter of 2022. And not all of these scenarios are guaranteed. Some are more probable than others, but any one of them alone could lead to much higher price inflation here in the US. And all 5 taken together could be a perfect storm that could even lead to hyperinflation and the loss of the dollar's world reserve status. So stick around, we're going to cover a lot of information today. Let's get to it. First of all, I do want to say a big thank you for tuning into the video today. If you get some value from it, please do give it a big thumbs up down below and consider subscribing to the channel. Okay, so the first scenario that could lead to much higher energy prices, much higher inflation by the end of 2022 is the European energy crisis. There's been a lot of back and forth over why Europe is getting squeezed so much in terms of energy. Is it the Russians are cutting the gas as a political move? Is it that they can't get the parts they need to keep the Nord Stream pipeline up and running because of sanctions? Truth somewhere probably in the middle, but the important thing here is that Europe doesn't have enough energy, and this winter, this problem is going to get a lot worse. Right now, the Nord Stream 1 pipeline is still flowing at about 20% capacity, and I suspect that the Russians might just be waiting until the winter to completely cut the flow of gas to Europe, to do it at the time when it's going to be the most painful for the European economies. One of the ways that the Germans have tried to mitigate this energy crisis is by firing up their old coal-powered plants, but there are some problems with that. First of all, Europe gets most of its coal from Russia as well. Something like 58% of its coal imports come from Russia, so it's not like they're switching from one unreliable energy source to another much more reliable source. But the other problem is right now Uniper, that's the big German utility company, they're warning that the Rhine River is getting to the point, it's getting so low that barges cannot deliver sufficient coal to the power plants. So this coal plan, this backup plan for Germany and for the rest of Europe might not be sufficient. It might not work out. There's a lot of problems with that as well. It hasn't really been a smooth transition. And I suspect that energy prices in Europe are going to skyrocket this winter. And that's going to put a lot of upward pressure on a number of products that get manufactured there, anything we import from Europe. And also it's going to spill over to the United States because we are going to be exporting more of our energy to Europe to try to supply those markets. And that brings us to scenario number 2, which is the European oil embargo against Russia is set to kick off in full this winter. And this is a Q&A from the European Commission regarding that oil embargo, which it passed and it's in place, but a lot of the features of that embargo have not kicked in yet. So let me read you a section from this Q&A. Question is, what is the scope of the oil restrictions? And I'm just going to read this whole thing to you because I think it's all very important and it gives us an idea of the timeline in which this is all going to go into effect. So the answer here is the EU will prohibit the import of seaborne crude oil from Russia with a transitory period of 6 months for existing contracts and spot transactions to allow global markets to adjust. The EU will also prohibit the import from Russia of refined petroleum products after a transitory period of 8 months for existing contracts and spot transactions. Imports by pipeline remain permitted for the time being. After a transitory period of 8 months, member states importing Russian crude and petroleum products via pipeline will not be able to resell these products to other member states or to third countries. This is in order to ensure a level playing field between member states. And then it says something about specific dependencies of various countries here, but then the important part, after a wind down period of 6 months, EU operators will be prohibited from insuring and financing the transport, in particular through maritime routes, of Russian oil to third countries. This will make it particularly difficult for Russia to continue exporting its crude oil and oil products to the rest of the world. And you'll notice this is a Q&A from the 3rd of June, 2022. So I'm not sure exactly when the clock starts ticking on that 6 to 8 month timer, but it sounds like we can expect to really feel the effects of this embargo starting in December. And it seems highly unlikely to me that the situation will improve between the West and Russia before then, but this oil embargo is going to be kicking in at a time when there is already going to be extreme energy scarcity in Europe, as I just mentioned, and that's going to put even more upward pressure on energy prices. Even if Western economies have been pushed into a severe recession by then, because there is a certain amount of inelastic demand for energy that just has to be met no matter how slow the economy gets. And this is going to affect the US as well. In fact, it's going to affect global markets because that lack of insurance for Russian oil being exported to the rest of the world. Don't forget, Russia is the single biggest exporter of energy globally. They produce like 10% of the world's crude oil. So this is going to have a tremendous effect on the global economy. And we are going to be striving to export energy to supply the European market as a result of this, and that is going to drive up energy prices here as well. And speaking of US energy prices, here's the third factor which is going to lead to much higher inflation and much higher energy prices later this year, and that is the cessation of oil sales from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. What we're looking at here is an announcement from the Department of Energy from the end of July. And I'll just read a small portion of it to you here. The president's announcement called to release 1 million barrels of SPR crude oil per day over 6 months. This historic release of SPR crude has provided a record amount of crude oil supply to the U.S. economy and will continue until the end of October 2022. So come November, that oil that is being supplied to the market, about 1 million barrels a day, is going to come to an end. And those sales, I'm sure those have been a contributing factor in the pullback of the price of oil that we have seen, along with other market forces as well. But certainly when those sales end, the oil market will become that much tighter as this additional supply will no longer be available. And as we know, higher oil and energy prices bleed over to just about every other aspect of the economy. So this will be contributing to higher prices and higher inflation. Now, before we get to the fourth scenario on today's list, I do want to say a big thank you to today's video sponsor, Silver Botanicals. Silver Botanicals makes all natural personal hygiene and household products that utilize the power of nano silver. Check out the link in the description to silverbotanicals.com, and don't forget to use coupon code STACKER to save 10% off your order. And right now in the month of August, if you use coupon code STACKER and you buy more than $50 worth of product, you'll be receiving a free Brilliant Uncirculated Silver Roosevelt dime with your order from Silver Botanicals. So check them out today. Now, the fourth factor that could lead to much worse price inflation later this year is a bit more speculative, but it's likely one of the worst scenarios we could face, and that is open conflict with China over Taiwan. And this has been in the media quite a bit this week. Seems like the focus has shifted completely away from Ukraine and all eyes are on Taiwan at the moment, following Nancy Pelosi's somewhat provocative visit to the island nation. And it seemed to me that just because the PLA didn't immediately invade the island after she landed or shoot down her plane or take any other really extreme action, that a lot of people seem to think that now the threat is over. But the PLA is now conducting massive war games around the island as a response. And one thing you have to understand about a place like China with an entrenched authoritarian government is that they can afford to play the long game. They're not trying to get things done in time for an election cycle. In fact, right now, Xi Jinping is focused on securing his position for a third term as the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, and he's dealing with China's domestic banking crisis, so right now is probably not the best time for him to launch a major conflict. He can afford to bide his time and launch the invasion when he's certain the outcome will be in China's favor. And we're getting closer to that time, it certainly seems like. And when it does eventually happen, the economic shockwave that results is going to lead to massively higher prices on just about everything imaginable. And even if we manage to avoid engaging the Chinese military in open warfare, it seems guaranteed that there would be massive economic sanctions levied against China if they made such a move. And we depend on China for a lot more than we depend on Russia. And if we lose access to Chinese manufacturing, well, empty shelves, those are going to be a real thing. And the price for whatever goods remains will be sky high. And this is not to mention that there are other ways that China can retaliate against the US in the meantime, short of an all-out invasion. And even if they leave Taiwan alone, they've still got $1 trillion in US Treasuries. This is an article from July from Reuters about how China and Japan have been dumping US Treasuries recently. And, if China decides to dump those in a big way, that could be a huge problem for us. The Fed is already supposedly committed to quantitative tightening. So who's going to buy all of those treasuries if the Chinese decide to dump them? Such a move could drive bond yields sky high. It would trigger a debt crisis, and then that would force the Fed to reverse policy from what they're doing now and commit to a massively inflationary program of bond purchases. Obviously, that's not guaranteed. Forecasting things like this, it's hard to assign any kind of timeline to this. This is all a bit speculative, but I don't think that we've seen the last of this situation with China. In fact, I think it's really just getting started, and if it continues to escalate as we approach winter, there is a real possibility that this conflict could lead to massively higher inflation this year. And finally, the fifth scenario, which could lead to much higher inflation this year, is a potential Fed pivot. So, we just got the second quarter GDP numbers. They were negative. The first quarter GDP numbers were negative. And you can redefine recession if you want. Maybe we're not technically in one, although the only real well-established rule of thumb is 2 consecutive quarters of shrinking GDP. But let's say we're not technically in a recession. The economy is still not doing great. We've got 9.1% year-over-year inflation, 2 quarters of shrinking GDP. We're also starting to get higher initial jobless claims now. So, the cracks are starting to show in the job numbers as well. And I think it's safe to say that this is not the super strong economy, the best economy the world has ever known, that we have been led to believe it is by the establishment. And when the fact that we are, in fact, in recession for real becomes apparent, there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Fed to come to the rescue. Who knows? Maybe we'll get another negative GDP print for quarter 3. And by then, it is possible, as I mentioned earlier, that the inflation numbers may have abated somewhat. Of course, this won't be falling prices, just the prices not going up as quickly. But by the time we get the Q3 GDP numbers at the end of October, if that's negative, that could be when the Fed really begins to consider a more accommodative policy. And I believe it's possible that the rate hikes might end by the end of 2022. Now, there's no guarantee of this, of course. Forecasting the precise timing of that sort of thing is not something I claim to be able to do with any accuracy, but it really would not surprise me if at least sometime in 2023, we do begin to see rate cuts and a return to quantitative easing by the Federal Reserve. And honestly, it could happen this year, depending on how quickly this economic deterioration that we are witnessing progresses. So that's 5 reasons that I think we have much higher inflation coming down the pipe, and why I think we could very likely see much higher inflation before the end of 2022. Now, will precious metals begin to move up with inflation when that happens? I would certainly expect that to be the case. At some point, it's going to become clear to investors that the dollar is not the safe haven they believe it to be. And when that happens, that will be the tipping point for precious metals, as cash will begin to flow into the only real safe havens left, gold and silver. Now, let me know what you think in the comments down below. I always like to hear what you have to say, and thank you all very much for watching. I will catch you next time. Smart Silver Stacker, out.